And when you're done, you simply pull out the pin and it unlocks. And now you can also see what the last hole in the base plate is for. But enough of that for now. There's still a lot of parts waiting to be made, and the next one is this attachment arm. And for this design it holds both the platen attachment and the work table, so this is pretty beefy and made from 40 by 40 millimeter square stock. In this case I didn't buy the stock oversized because it would have been too much work to mill everything down. So after facing all these sides it's going to end up slightly smaller than 40 by 40, but I did account for that when I was making the parts for the sleeve that this goes into. You can actually tell here by the lines in the surface finish that this end mill is sharp in some spots and dull in others, depending on how I mistreated it. Now I'm doing a little test fit just to see if it actually goes in the sleeve. And the fit's pretty good. It's not super tight, so it slides easily, but there's not a lot of side to side play, so I'm happy with that. These big holes don't make much sense right now, but you'll see what that's about in the next video. And this one is where the flat platen frame is going to attach. Last step is this channel, which is there to provide a lowered surface that the locking lever will clamp down on, so that when the surface gets a little uneven, that doesn't interfere with this part sliding in and out. Next part is just a little handle for that lever. It's not very important, but it was kind of bugging me to just hold on to a screw there. It's gonna end up looking a little bit different than in the CAD model, because I just grabbed a random piece of stock that looked about right, and then I just kind of freestyled the shape. Every once in a while it's nice to make a part where the dimensions don't really matter and you can just sort of eyeball everything. At first I was gonna give this a knurled surface, but I kinda got lazy and just started cutting a bunch of grooves in it. But I actually ended up really liking how that looks. Kinda looks like something you'd find on a lightsaber. Okay, next part is pretty small, but pretty important. It's this little hinge for the belt tracking. Now, it would have been smart to make this out of an L-shaped profile, but for some reason that didn't occur to me, so I used a solid block, and somehow it also didn't occur to me I could have removed the majority of this material on the bandsaw, so I just brute forced it by turning half this block into chips. I'm gonna install this part in a minute, but first we're gonna switch it up because the next part I'm gonna make is the base, and that's the only part that's going to be TIG welded. When I was designing this, I put in as many weird angles as I could, so that means there's a lot of miters to cut now. And again, I'm doing some roundovers on the mill, which is super inconvenient, especially with these hollow parts, but it somehow worked out. I often don't bother doing this, but this time I actually did some actual prep work and took off all the mill scale and chamfered all the edges on the tubing in order to get some decent weld penetration. If the parts aren't too big, I like to tack weld this kind of stuff in a vise because it keeps down the distortion and makes sure everything is straight and parallel. The fact that I'm using a machine vise for this is probably gonna ruffle some feathers, but at least I'm not MIG welding in this. And here you can see it actually comes out nice and flat. I'm tacking up all the smaller parts into bigger segments now, making sure those are straight, which is much easier than trying to get a whole bunch of stuff lined up all at once. Again, adding some plastic washers here because I don't want steel rubbing on steel. Now I'm using the grinder itself as a jig to hold these things where they need to be, and that saves me a whole bunch of measuring and aligning stuff. Clamping a straight edge on there to keep these things in one plane, and then I can tack this little bridge in between them. That seems to work nicely, so I can remove this part again and then join it with the rest. I was kind of expecting this, but the top ended up not being level, so I used a little trick. I cut open the tack welds on the inside and then started bending the top back and put some filler rod into the gap to keep that bend into a good position. And then I just cut off the filler rod and the rest is just gonna melt into the weld puddle. And now it's time to finish up all these welds. And after a lot of welding, here's the finished base. I didn't bother checking again if it's square, but it looks good enough. Now I can attach the finished base to the rest, which is nice because it allows me to finally mount the motor on there. This is a brand new 1.5 kilowatt or 2 horsepower 3-phase motor, and it's going to be controlled by a VFD. And thank God I didn't mess up any of those holes, because that would have really sucked at this point. Now let's install that little hinge thing for the tracking feature. So the tracking wheel tilts up and down by adjusting this bolt, and of course that's going to be replaced by a nice handle. We are now nearing the end of the first video, but before that I want to show you the tilting feature. It uses two separate locking mechanisms. There's another locking pin which automatically holds it in place when you flip it up into horizontal mode. And then you can use the big lever to lock it down tightly. So the same principle I used on the tension lever, you just flip this up and it stays there and you don't have to hold anything in place. Now when everything is done, the machine will be balanced so that it stays in the vertical position by default due to its own weight. So it's always either locked vertically by gravity or horizontally by that pin. But of course for actually using it you would lock it down using the big lever. And with that we have reached the end of the first part of this build. Next time I'm going to be making all of these components, and if you don't want to miss that, you might want to consider subscribing. As always, thanks for watching and see you in part 2.